How do we really decide what a law actually means? For, centuries, the biggest brains in legal philosophy have been tackling these questions from their armchairs, just using logic and thought experiments. But now, a whole new field is taking these questions out of the armchair and into the lab, using data to test our deepest feelings about what's fair and just. So let's dive into this amazing world of experimental jurisprudence.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the classic way of doing things, law's armchair thought experiments. Then, we'll see what happens when jurisprudence enters the lab. After that, we'll look at a real study that tests our legal intuitions. We'll also cover the big counterargument, the expertise defense. And finally, we'll explore the wild difference between the law in books and the law inside our own heads.
Okay, so first up, how did people traditionally think about the really big questions in law? Well, it all starts with some pretty clever puzzles.
Let me throw a classic at you. Imagine a park with a big sign that says no vehicles in the park. Suddenly, an ambulance speeds in to save someone's life. Is that ambulance technically breaking the law? It seems like a simple question, but man, the implications are surprisingly deep.
See, here's the fundamental problem. The text of the rule is crystal clear, no vehicles. But the purpose, the whole reason the rule exists, is to keep people safe. And letting an ambulance in, well, that obviously serves the purpose of safety. This clash between the literal words on a page and the spirit of the law, that's a puzzle philosophers have been wrestling with forever.
And this whole traditional method of thinking things through, it has a name, jurisprudence. It's basically the philosophy of law. And historically, it's been all about deep thought, where brilliant minds use these kinds of hypotheticals, like our ambulance in the park, to try and figure out the true nature of law itself. But here's the absolute key. These giants of legal philosophy, they built their entire theories on one huge assumption, that their gut feelings about these cases are universal. They're always talking about what we would say, or what all of us would agree is law. They're assuming we all share the same common sense on this. But what if we don't?
And that single question, what if we don't agree, leads us straight into our next section. It's about a radical new approach that takes these old assumptions and really puts them under the microscope. Say hello to experimental jurisprudence, or XJur, as folks in the field call it. Instead of just relying on what one philosopher thinks in their armchair, XJur uses the tools of cognitive science, running actual experiments with real people, to see what we all actually think. It doesn't throw out the old way, but it adds this powerful new layer of real-world evidence. I mean, this is the million-dollar question that drives this entire field, right? What if our gut feelings about what a vehicle is or what makes a law feel legitimate are not universal at all? What if they change depending on your culture, your background, or just you? If that's true, it could shake the very foundations of how we've thought about law for centuries.
The shift is actually really simple, but it's profound. The old way relies on one person's intuition and just assumes we all agree. The new way, experimental jurisprudence, turns that assumption into a question it can actually test. It goes out and collects data from tons of people to see if that understanding is really shared. It's basically a move from I think, therefore it is, to let's go find out.
Okay, so this all sounds good in theory, but how does it actually work? Let's look at a fantastic example where researchers took that classic vehicles in the park idea and turned it into a real-life study.
So what the researchers did was super clever. They came up with 4 different scenarios. First, you have the core case, a car speeding through the park. It breaks the literal rule and it's dangerous. Easy. But then it gets tricky. They had an over-inclusive case, a historic army truck welded onto a monument. It's a vehicle, so it violates the text, but it's not a danger to anyone. Then an under-inclusive case, someone wildly swinging a chainsaw. It's not a vehicle, but it's definitely violating the safety purpose of the rule. And then they had a totally normal case, just someone walking, as a baseline. Then they asked people a simple question. In which of these cases was the rule actually broken?
And the results? They're just fascinating. So no surprise, nearly everybody said the speeding car was a violation. Of course. But check out the middle bars. A whole lot of people said the monument truck, the one that only violates the text, was still a violation. And even for the chainsaw, which only violates the purpose, some people said, yep, that's breaking the rule too. This tells us something really important.
So here's the big takeaway. For regular people, it seems like both the literal words of the rule and its purpose matter. But, and this is the key insight we get from the data, the literal text seems to have a stronger pull. We're just more likely to call something a violation if it breaks the words on the sign, even if it isn't really causing the problem the sign was meant to prevent. That's a subtle point the armchair method could easily miss.
Now, as you can imagine, this new approach has its critics.
So let's be fair and look at the biggest challenge to experimental jurisprudence. It's called the expertise defense. This really gets to the absolute heart of the debate. Exter studies often survey regular people, lay people, without any legal training. But should we be asking them about these super complex legal ideas? Or should we only really care about what judges, lawyers, and legal philosophers have to say?
So the people who support this expertise defense, they make a few key points. First, they argue that the intuitions of everyday folks might be kind of messy or inconsistent. Second, they say you really need specialized training to think clearly about these deep legal questions. And third, and this is a big one, they argue that at the end of the day, the meaning of a law is decided by legal officials, not by a public poll. It's a really strong counterargument, and it's one that ex-jur has to grapple with.
But the discoveries from ex-jur go way beyond just poking holes in old theories. They also reveal some mind-blowing things about how our brains even build the idea of law in the first place. And that leads us to our final section.
It turns out ex-jur has borrowed this really powerful idea from cognitive science called a dual character concept. Don't worry about the jargon. It's just a fancy name for a concept that we judge on two different levels at the same time. A descriptive level, which is just about what something is, and a normative level, which is about what something truly ought to be.
The perfect example is the word scientist. Okay, so descriptively, someone who works in a lab and publishes papers is a scientist. That's the definition. But what if they fake all their data? We might say something like, well, okay, technically he's a scientist, but he's not a true scientist. See what happened there? That's the normative part, our ideal of what a scientist should be kicking in.
And what's so cool is that this exact same logic seems to apply to the concept of law. Extra research strongly suggests law is one of these dual character concepts. So when people are faced with a really horrible, unjust rule, they might agree, yeah, I guess that's technically the law on the books. That's the descriptive part. But at the same time, they feel that it's not what law ought to be. It's not a true law. This idea helps explain so many of the seemingly contradictory feelings people have about the law.
So why does all this matter? It matters because it shows our understanding of law is not as simple as just reading rules in a book. It's a deep, complex, psychological thing. Experimental jurisprudence gives us the tools to start mapping out this hidden world, the complicated and sometimes messy relationship between the formal law on the books and the intuitive, moral law in our minds.
And all of this leaves us with one final massive question. If we can now actually measure how people intuitively understand concepts like justice and fairness, what are we supposed to do with that information? Should the formal laws we write, the law in the books, be changed to better match our shared and now measurable sense of what is right? That's the provocative challenge that experimental jurisprudence leaves on the table for all of us.